A widow's footsteps echo on Wyoming's scorched earth, her infant son strapped to her back. A hidden Colt Peacemaker, her only shield from a past stained with blood and betrayal. Eleanor Ellie Wade arrives at Three Pines Ranch in 1886, hired to clean stables, not to mend broken lives. Yet, in a land where mercy is as scarce as rain, her choices spark whispers of treason and ignite a debt that could burn everything down. Will her courage forge a new family or bury her in the dust? Subscribe now, share where you're listening from, and uncover how one woman's heart battles a frontier's wrath. Can a buried gun truly silence the past? The Wyoming Territory, sun beat down like a blacksmith's hammer, scorching the earth to a cracked, thirsty crust in the summer of 1886. Dust swirled around the rickety stagecoach as it groaned to a stop at the edge of Three Pines Ranch, its wheels sinking into the parched ground. Eleanor Ellie Wade stepped down, her boots kicking up clouds of grit that clung to her faded gray dress. A canvas bag hung from her shoulder, heavy with the weight of a Colt Peacemaker wrapped in an old shawl, her husband's last relic, a ghost of a man hanged for desertion. Strapped to her back, her infant son stirred in his sling, his tiny breaths warm against her neck. She adjusted the sling, her calloused hands steady despite the tremor in her chest. Three Pines. Ranch sprawled before her, a rugged kingdom of weathered fences and cottonwoods clawing at the sky. The barn loomed in the distance, its red paint peeling like old skin, while the main house stood aloof, its windows dark as closed eyes. Asa Hartwell waited by the gate, his black hat shadowing a face carved by grief and war. A former Union captain, he carried the weight of a wife lost to fire and 2 children left motherless. His arms were crossed, his voice rough as gravel. "You the one for the barn job?" Ellie met his gaze, her eyes steady but hollowed by nights without rest. "Yes, sir. I work hard. I don't trouble anybody." Her voice was low, cautious, like a horse treading near a rattler's den. Asa studied her, gaunt, alone, a woman who looked like she'd been whittled down by life's sharp edges. "Barn's out back," he said. "You sleep in the loft. Feed yourself. Stay clear of the house and my kids, Tommy and Rose. Understood?" She nodded once, sharp and final, and turned toward the barn, the wind tugging at her shawl like it wanted her secrets. The barn smelled of hay and horse sweat, its slats creaking under the sun's relentless glare. Ellie set her bag down, the Colt's weight a quiet reminder of vows she'd made to never touch it again. Her son cooed softly, and she adjusted him in the sling, her fingers brushing his tiny head, as if to anchor herself. She started work before dawn the next day, scrubbing stalls, shoveling manure, and hauling water until her shoulders burned. The horses, wild-eyed and skittish, grew calm under her touch. She moved like she understood their fear, whispering low to a sorrel mare that snorted and stamped until it finally lowered its head, nuzzling her hand. Asa passed by sometimes, his boots crunching on the dirt. He didn't speak, but his eyes lingered, not with warmth, but with something puzzled, like he was trying to read a map in a language he'd forgotten. Once, under the noon sun, he saw her kneeling by a trough, sweat soaking her dress, her son asleep against her back. He tossed her a rag and a tin cup of water without a word. She looked up, startled, her lips parting as if to speak, but he was already walking away, his shadow long and unyielding. The ranch hands noticed her, too, but their glances were sharp, edged with suspicion. Harris, the foreman, leaned against a fence post one evening, chewing a toothpick. "She's too quiet," he muttered to Mara, the cook. "A woman like that's hiding something." Mara smirked, her eyes glinting like broken glass. "Bet she's after the boss's favor. Or them kids." Ellie overheard, her hands tightening on the pitchfork, but she kept her head down, scraping the stall floor until her knuckles bled. Nights were worse. The loft was a thin mattress under a leaking roof, the wind howling through the cracks like voices from her past. She'd lie awake, her son's soft breathing her only tether, while memories of Red Hollow clawed at her, smoke, screams, and a Comanche warrior's bloodied face. She'd sworn to bury that life, but it followed her like a shadow. One night, as thunder rumbled in the distance, she heard cries from the main house, Tommy and Rose, their voices piercing the dark. Ellie froze, her heart hammering. She wasn't allowed near them, but the cries grew sharper, desperate, pulling at something raw inside her. She stood, shawl tight around her shoulders, and stepped into the night, the barn door creaking shut behind her like a warning. What had she walked into? A ranch built on grief, a man walled off by loss, and children crying for a warmth she wasn't supposed to give. The Colt in her bag felt heavier, its cold steel whispering of debts unpaid and dangers yet to come. The barn door's creak faded into the Wyoming night, leaving Ellie Wade standing in the dark, the cries of Asa's children echoing like a call she couldn't answer. 3 months earlier, another call had pulled her into a different kind of darkness, one that still burned in her memory like a coal refusing to die. Red Hollow Mine crouched in the shadow of jagged hills, its mouth a gaping wound in the earth, belching dust and the stench of sulfur. It was spring 1886, and Ellie worked the cook fire for the miners, her infant son slung against her back, his small weight her only anchor in a world that had already taken her husband. The camp was a hardscrabble sprawl of tents and lean-tos, men with sunburned faces and greedy eyes digging for gold that rarely came. Ellie kept her head down, stirring beans over a fire, her hands raw from chopping wood and hauling water. The miners barely spoke to her, their glances sharp with distrust for a woman alone. But she didn't care. Her son's soft gurgles kept her moving, each breath a promise to keep him safe. Dawn broke gray that day, the air heavy with the threat of something worse than rain. The miners were restless, muttering about a vein they'd tapped too deeply. Ellie was tending the fire when a low rumble shook the ground, like the earth itself was coughing up its secrets. Shouts erupted, men scrambling as the foreman bellowed about a misfired charge. She froze, her son stirring against her back, when a sharper sound cut through. A man's groan, raw and desperate, from the mine's mouth. She dropped the ladle and ran, dust stinging her eyes, her boots slipping on loose gravel. Inside the mine's entrance, shadows danced in the flickering torchlight. A man lay half buried under a pile of shattered rock, his copper skin streaked with blood, his black hair matted with dirt. Tahan, a Comanche warrior, though she didn't know his name then. His eyes, sharp with pain, met hers. "Go," he rasped, but she didn't. Her son whimpered, and she tightened the sling, her heart pounding like a war drum. She grabbed a nearby pry bar, its iron cold against her palms, and started digging, ignoring the shouts of miners behind her. Stones tore at her hands, blood mixing with dirt, but she pried until the rocks gave way, freeing Tahan's legs. The ground trembled again, a deeper roar building in the mine's belly. "It's gonna blow," a miner yelled, and panic surged through the camp. Ellie's breath caught, her son's cries piercing her focus. She dragged Tahan to a rusted ore cart, its wheels squealing as she shoved him in. Her arms burned, her back ached under her son's weight, but she pushed the cart toward the mouth of the mine, rocks falling around them. Tahan gripped the cart's edge, his voice hoarse. "Your boy! Get him out!" She didn't answer, her jaw set, her boots digging into the dirt as she shoved the cart into daylight, just as a blast tore through the mine behind them. The shockwave knocked her to her knees, dust choking the air, but her son was safe, still crying against her back, and Tahan was alive, slumped in the cart. The miners' eyes turned cold as they gathered. "That's one of them savages," a man spat, pointing at Tahan. "Heard Comanches have been raiding camps." Whispers grew into accusations, pinning the explosion on sabotage, on Ellie for saving the wrong man. Tahan met her gaze, his voice low. "You saved my breath. I owe you." Before she could respond, he slipped into the sagebrush, vanishing like smoke. The miners' glares burned into her, their words sharp as knives. "Traitor's wife, now a red man's friend," one sneered. That night, under a moonless sky, Ellie knelt in the dirt, her son asleep in her arms. She buried the Colt Peacemaker, its steel cold as her resolve to never again touch the violence it carried. Back at Three Pines, the memory of that day clung to her like the dust on her boots. She stood outside the barn, the distant cries of Tommy and Rose fading into the wind. Her hand brushed the sling where her son slept, safe but fragile. She'd saved a man in Red Hollow, but at what cost? The whispers of betrayal followed her here, and the weight of the buried gun felt heavier than ever, as if the earth itself was calling it back to her hands. The weight of the buried Colt pressed on Ellie Wade's mind as she stood outside the barn, the Wyoming night swallowing the last echoes of Tommy and Rose's cries. Red Hollow's dust still clung to her boots, but here at Three Pines Ranch, it was the silence that cut deepest, a silence that hid grief and secrets alike. Summer 1886 baked the plains, the air thick with the scent of sagebrush and horsehide. Ellie's days began before the stars faded, her son strapped to her back, his soft weight grounding her as she hauled buckets and scrubbed stalls. The barn was her world now, its splintered beams and straw-strewn floor, a refuge from the ranch hand's sidelong glances. She worked until her hands cracked, her muscles aching under the relentless sun. The horses trusted her, their wild eyes softening when she approached, as if they sensed the quiet strength she carried, forged in pain she never spoke of. A black stallion, prone to biting, let her stroke its muzzle, its breath warm against her palm. She whispered to it, her voice low like a prayer, and it stood still, as if listening. Asa Hartwell kept his distance, his shadow passing like a hawk over the fields. But Ellie noticed his pauses, brief, deliberate moments when he watched her work, his face unreadable beneath his hat. Once, as she wrestled a bale of hay, her son cooing softly, Asa stopped nearby, his boot scuffing the dirt. "Horses don't usually take to strangers," he said, his voice rough but curious. Ellie straightened, wiping sweat from her brow. "Maybe they know I ain't here to hurt 'em." He nodded just once and walked on, but the air felt different after that, like a door had cracked open. The ranch hands, though, saw no such door. Harris, the foreman, spat tobacco juice near her feet one afternoon, his eyes narrow. "She's too good with them horses," he muttered to Mara, who stirred a pot in the cookhouse. "Ain't natural for a woman like her." Mara's laugh was sharp, like a blade on a whetstone. "She's playing a long game. Mark my words, she's after something." Ellie heard them, her grip tightening on the broom, but she kept sweeping, her son's soft breaths against her back, urging her to stay silent. Nights in the loft were a battle against memory, the wind rattling the barn like bones in a box. She'd rock her son, his tiny hands clutching her shawl, and try to drown out Red Hollow's ghosts. But one night, as thunder growled on the horizon, a different sound pierced the dark. Sharp, keening cries from the main house. Tommy and Rose, Asa's twins, their voices like knives in the quiet. Ellie sat up, her heart thudding. She wasn't allowed near the house. Asa's rules were clear as barbed wire. But the cries grew frantic, raw, pulling at the same instinct that had driven her to dig Tahan from the rubble. She hesitated, her son stirring in his sling, then pulled her shawl tight and crept down the ladder, the night air cold against her skin. The main house loomed, its windows flickering with lantern light. Ellie slipped through the shadows, her boots silent on the porch. Inside, Asa stood in the nursery, his broad shoulders slumped, his hands useless against the twins' wails. Tommy thrashed in his crib, Rose's face red with tears. Ellie paused at the threshold, her breath shallow. "I can try," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Asa turned, his eyes hard but desperate. "You ain't supposed to be here." She didn't flinch. "They're hurtin'." "I know that sound." He stepped aside, silent, his jaw tight. Ellie lifted Rose first, her son still strapped to her back, and began to hum a Cherokee lullaby her husband had taught her, its notes heavy with loss. The melody wasn't pretty, but it was steady, like a river carving through stone. Rose quieted, her sobs easing, and Tommy followed, his small hands reaching for Ellie's dress. Asa watched, his face shadowed, something breaking in his silence. "That song," he said, his voice low. "Ruth used to sing it." Ellie met his gaze. "It's older than us. It's for the ones who ain't here no more." The twins slept, their breath soft, and Ellie stepped back, her son's warmth grounding her. As she turned to leave, Asa's voice stopped her. "Why do you care?" She paused, her hand on the doorframe. "Someone's gotta." If this story's pulling you in, folks, hit that subscribe button and let us know where you're listening from. It keeps these tales alive, just like Ellie keeps pushing through the dark. She walked back to the barn, the lullaby still humming in her throat, unaware that the hand's whispers were sharpening, ready to cut deeper than any blade. The lullaby's echo lingered in Ellie Wade's throat as she stepped back into the barn, the Wyoming night heavy with the threat of storm. The twins' cries had quieted, but the whispers of Three Pines Ranch were growing louder, sharpening into something that could draw blood. Summer 1886 hung over the ranch like a fever, the air thick with dust and tension. Ellie's days were a blur of labor, her son strapped to her back as she mucked stalls and hauled feed, her hands raw but steady. She kept to herself, her presence a shadow that didn't invite questions. But the ranch hand's eyes followed her, their murmurs coiling like smoke. Harris, the foreman, had taken to watching her too closely, his gaze lingering on her bag in the loft, where the Colt Peacemaker lay hidden, wrapped in her husband's old shawl. She caught him once, his shadow looming near her things, and her pulse quickened. But she said nothing, her jaw tight as she turned back to her work. One evening, as the sky bruised purple and thunder muttered in the distance, Harris cornered her in the barn. He held the unwrapped Colt, its steel glinting in the lantern light. "What's a woman like you doing with this?" he demanded, his voice low and mean. Ellie's son stirred against her back, and she stood tall, her eyes cold as river stones. "It ain't yours to touch," she said. Harris smirked, tossing the gun onto her pallet. "Boss'll hear about this. You ain't as clean as you act." He left, his boots echoing like a warning shot. By dawn, Asa Hartwell stood at the barn door, his face hard as flint. "You carry a gun?" he asked, his voice low but sharp. Ellie met his gaze, her son's soft breathing steadying her. "I carried it to bury it," she said. "I shot once, to save a man, not to kill." She told him of Red Hollow, pushing Tahan, the Comanche warrior, out of the mine's collapsing jaws, her son safe on her back. Asa's eyes darkened. "Tahan, the Comanche butcher? You saved him?" His voice was a growl, heavy with old wounds from the war. "That man's kind, burned half this territory." Ellie didn't flinch. "I saved a life. Didn't ask his name or his sins." Asa's jaw clenched, his fists tight. "You're gone by morning," he said, turning away, the barn door slamming shut behind him. The day dragged, the air thick with the coming storm. Ellie packed her bag, her son asleep in his sling, her hand steady despite the ache in her chest. She'd leave at first light, head south, away from the whispers and Asa's anger. But as night fell, the sky split open, rain lashing the ranch like a whip. Lightning cracked, and shouts rose from the main house. Ellie froze, her son stirring. Hooves thundered outside, not from the storm, but from men. Riders in the dark, their voices rough with greed. She peered through a crack in the barn, seeing shadows move toward the house, torches flickering in the downpour. The attackers were deserters, men Harris had once run with, now after gold, rumored to be hidden in a cellar beneath the ranch. A gunshot rang out, and Ellie's breath caught. She heard Tommy and Rose's cries, sharp and terrified, from the house. Asa's shout followed, cut short by a thud. Ellie's hand went to her bag, the Colt's weight cold and familiar. She hesitated, her son's warmth against her back a reminder of her vow to never touch it again. But the twin screams tore through her, and she grabbed the gun, tucking it into her waistband. She ran through the rain, her boots sinking in mud, her son shielded by her shawl. The house was chaos, furniture overturned, Asa slumped against a wall, blood trickling from his temple. The twins huddled in a corner, a bearded man looming over them, his knife glinting. Ellie didn't think. She drew the Colt, her voice steady. "Step back." The man laughed, but his eyes wavered. Before he could move, a shadow burst through the door. Tahan, his chest scarred, his bow drawn taut. "Dead of breath," he said, his voice like gravel. "I pay it now." Ellie and Tahan fought side by side, her bullets precise, his arrows silent. The deserters fell, some fleeing into the storm. Tahan took a shot to the shoulder, blood soaking his shirt, but he stood firm until the last man ran. He turned to Ellie, his eyes fierce. "Tell them blood can heal," he said, then collapsed, the rain washing his wounds clean. Ellie knelt beside him, her son's soft cries mixing with the storm's roar, the Colt heavy in her hand, its purpose fulfilled, but its cost still unknown. The rain's roar softened to a whisper, leaving Ellie Wade kneeling beside Tahan's fallen form, her son's cries a faint pulse against the storm's dying breath. The Colt Peacemaker, heavy in her hand, felt like a chain she'd carried too long, its steel warmed by her grip, but cold, with purpose. Dawn broke over Three Pines Ranch in the summer of 1886, painting the Wyoming plains in pale gold. The air smelled of wet earth and charred wood, the ranch a battlefield of splintered fences and smoldering debris. Ellie stood by a shallow grave she'd dug near the cottonwoods, her son strapped to her back, his soft warmth steadying her trembling hands. Tahan's body lay wrapped in a blanket, his scarred chest still, his final words, "Blood can heal," etched into her mind. Beside him, she placed the Colt, its barrel glinting one last time before she shoveled dirt over it. "I buried you once for fear," she murmured, her voice low as the wind. "Now, I bury you for peace." The earth swallowed the gun, and with it, the weight of her past. Asa Hartwell watched from a distance, his temple bandaged, his eyes hollow but sharp. Tommy and Rose clung to his legs, their faces pale but calm, as if Ellie's presence had stitched something broken back together. The ranch hands gathered, their boots heavy in the mud, their whispers silenced by the night's violence. Harris was gone, fled with the surviving deserters, his betrayal a wound no one spoke of. Ellie stood, wiping dirt from her hands, and met Asa's gaze. "I'm leaving," she said, her voice steady but tired. South, where the air's cleaner. Asa's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue, his silence heavy with something unspoken. The town stirred by midday, word of the attack spreading like wildfire. At the general store, voices hissed with accusation. Ellie, the widow who'd saved a Comanche, now blamed for bringing trouble to Three Pines. "She's one of them," a shopkeeper muttered, his eyes narrow. "Brought that savage here to burn us out." Ellie heard the talk as she passed through town, her son asleep in his sling, her bag slung over her shoulder. She kept her head high, her boots steady on the warped boardwalk, but the words cut deeper than she'd admit. She'd saved lives, but to them, she was a shadow cast by Tahan's name. Asa found her at the edge of town, her figure small against the vast plains. "They're calling for you," he said, his voice rough but firm. "Say you're a traitor." Ellie's lips pressed thin. "Let 'em talk. I ain't staying to argue." But Asa stepped closer, his hand resting on Tommy's shoulder as Rose clutched his other arm. "You ain't running either," he said. "Not after what you did." He turned, leading her back to the ranch, where a crowd had gathered. Ranchers, townsfolk, their faces a mix of suspicion and curiosity. At the barn, Asa climbed onto a crate, his voice carrying over the murmurs. "This woman," he said, pointing to Ellie, "stood between my kids and a blade last night. She fought when I couldn't. She buried a gun today, not to hide it, but to kill the hate it carried." The crowd stilled, their eyes shifting to Ellie, who stood with her son, her back straight as iron. "If she's a traitor," Asa continued, "then so am I, for letting her save what's mine." An old rancher nodded, his weathered face softening. A woman in the back, her hands worn from years of toil, spoke up. "She didn't run. That's more than most." Murmurs of agreement rippled through the crowd, drowning out the last of the accusations. Ellie left at dusk, her son stirring as she walked south, the plains stretching endlessly before her. She didn't look back, but the weight of Three Pines lingered, a place where she'd been both outcast and savior. Each spring, a small canvas bag appeared at the ranch gate, honey and a scrap of Comanche-patterned cloth, a quiet reminder of her. Asa kept them in a tin box, never speaking of it. One evening, he took Tommy and Rose to the cottonwoods, where Tahan's grave lay under new grass. "She buried a gun," he said, his voice low, "but planted something better. Mercy, the kind this land don't know." The twins nodded, their small hands clutching wildflowers they'd picked. The sun sank, casting the hills in fire-red light. Ellie's shadow was gone, but her mark remained, carved into a place once ruled by blood and suspicion, now softened by a woman who'd chosen to save rather than destroy. The Wyoming plains hold Ellie's story, where a buried gun became a seed of mercy. Her courage in the face of betrayal and storm reshaped a land ruled by suspicion. What did her journey stir in you? Did her choice to save, to fight, to forgive, echo in your own heart? Share your thoughts below. Let's hear where this tale took you. I'm grateful for every moment you've spent with us, riding through this frontier of loss and redemption. Until our next story, keep carrying the light of compassion wherever your trail leads. We'll meet again under these wide skies, where the heart always finds its way.